Welcome to Midnight Grove, where stories whisper in the quiet hours of the night. Tonight's tale, The House of Sleeping Books, follows Marion, a traveler who stumbles upon a bookshop she swears wasn't there yesterday. Inside, she finds books that breathe, hum, and wait for the right reader. But when she discovers a book with her own name written inside, she is pulled into a world of forgotten stories, ones she left behind long ago. Some books are never truly lost. Some stories wait patiently to be told. So settle in, listen closely, and let this story remind you of the ones you've yet to finish. Chapter 1: The Bookshop That Wasn't There Yesterday. Marion had been wandering the streets of Saint-Vienne for nearly an hour. The old European town had been her home for only 3 weeks, but already she had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Morning coffee at the corner cafe, afternoons spent sketching in the park, and long, aimless evening walks before heading back to her small rented flat. Tonight, however, the streets felt different. Not unsettling, not eerie, just new. Which was strange because she had walked this route a dozen times before. And yet somehow, the bookshop in front of her had never been there yesterday. A bookshop that only opened at night. It had no sign above the door. No bright window displays. Just a single golden light glowing from within, flickering gently against the glass. A chalkboard stood just outside, its elegant script barely illuminated in the dim alleyway. The House of Sleeping Books, open from dusk until dawn. Marion hesitated. She wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere, and something about the bookshop, the way it seemed tucked away from time itself, made her curious. Before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped inside. And the moment she did, the world outside faded away. The smell of forgotten stories. A bell chimed softly as the door shut behind her. The air inside was warm, filled with the scent of aged paper, ink, and something faintly floral, like pressed lavender between pages. The bookshop was larger than it looked from the outside. Rows upon rows of tall wooden bookshelves stretched toward the ceiling, each one overflowing with old leather-bound volumes, delicate paperbacks, and books with no visible titles. Candles flickered in ornate brass holders. A spiral staircase led to an upper level, where even more bookshelves curved along the balcony. And perhaps strangest of all, some of the books on the shelves were breathing. Books that dream. Marion's breath caught. The books weren't moving in any dramatic way. No fluttering pages, no floating in midair. But they were alive. Their covers rose and fell as if taking slow, steady breaths. Some hummed so faintly, it was almost imperceptible, like a whisper of a dream. It wasn't unsettling, it was calming, like stepping into a place where time itself had slowed. "Bienvenue," a voice murmured. Marion turned. Behind the counter stood a bookseller, an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with silver-threaded hair and a dark vest over a crisp white shirt. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes, a warm, knowing brown, studied her with quiet curiosity. "You are welcome to look," he said in lightly accented English. "The books here wait for the right reader." Marion hesitated. "What does that mean?" The bookseller simply smiled. "You will see," The book that knew her name. Marion wandered the aisles, fingertips brushing the worn spines. Some books had titles etched in gold, others bore no markings at all. And then she saw it, a book that was already open, sitting on a velvet cushion, its pages glowing faintly in the candlelight. Drawn by something she couldn't explain, Marion stepped closer, and her breath caught, because at the top of the open page, written in delicate, looping script, was a name. Her name, Marion Evelyn Carter. Her pulse quickened. She looked around, half expecting someone to explain, to tell her this was a mistake. But no one did. The book had been waiting for her. And slowly, carefully, she reached out and turned the page. And the moment she did, she wasn't in the bookshop anymore. A story she had forgotten. The world around her shifted. 1 second she was standing in the warm glow of the bookshop. The next she was somewhere else, somewhere familiar. A cobblestone street, the smell of summer rain, the distant hum of a city settling into evening. And at the center of it all, a little girl. Marion's breath hitched. She knew this street. She knew this moment. Because the little girl sitting on the steps, flipping through a worn picture book, was her. At 7 years old, the first book she ever loved. Marion watched in stunned silence as her younger self traced the illustrations with tiny fingers, completely lost in the story. She remembered this day. She remembered the book, an old second-hand collection of fairy tales her mother had given her. She had read it over and over again until the pages were soft and frayed, until she could recite the stories by heart. She had believed for the longest time that stories held real magic, that they could transport you, change you, shape the way you saw the world. And yet, she had forgotten. At some point, between growing up and growing tired, she had let go of that feeling. She had stopped believing in magic, stopped believing in stories that waited for the right reader. Until now, until tonight. A book that remembered. The world shifted again. Marion blinked, and she was back in the bookshop. The book was still open in front of her, and for the first time in years, she felt something bloom inside her chest, something she thought she had lost. The bookseller stepped beside her, his voice gentle. "The books here do not tell new stories," he murmured. "They remind you of the ones you left behind." Marion let out a slow breath. Her fingers traced the gold lettering on the book's cover. It had no title, because the title was hers. Her story, waiting for her to remember. And tonight, she finally had. Chapter 2. The story that was never finished. Marion sat motionless, staring at the open book in front of her. Her name was written on the page, in the same delicate script she had seen before. But now there was more. Below her name, a passage had begun to appear on its own, words forming in smooth, curling ink, as if the book was writing itself. A forgotten chapter. Marion watched as the letters took shape. At first, she thought it was simply a memory, describing the moment she had just experienced, the day she first fell in love with books as a child. But then The words kept going, telling a story she didn't quite recognize. There was once a girl who believed that stories could be anything. Doors, windows, even wings. She would sit for hours, lost in the pages, believing in magic without question. But one day she stopped believing, and the stories waited, patient and quiet, for her to return. Marion's pulse quickened. She traced her fingers along the ink. It was smooth, not printed, not typed. It had been written for her. "Is this—" She hesitated, looking up at the bookseller. "Is this my life?" The bookseller's warm, knowing eyes met hers. "Not all of it," he said softly. "Only the part you left unfinished. The unwritten pages." Marion stared at the book, her thoughts tangled. It was true, wasn't it? She had been that child. The one who carried a book everywhere, who stayed up late under the covers with a flashlight, devouring stories as if they were oxygen. She had written stories too once, filling notebooks with half-formed ideas, sketches of characters she was certain would live forever. And then she had stopped. Not all at once, not with a grand, dramatic decision, but gradually as life pulled her in different directions. Deadlines replaced daydreams, emails replaced stories. She still read, of course, but it was different now, something quiet, something passive. The belief she had once carried, the certainty that stories were more than just words, had faded. And now, sitting in this impossible bookshop, it was as if the books had been waiting for her to notice, the library of lost stories. The bookseller motioned for her to follow him. Still dazed, Marion stood, leaving the open book behind as she trailed him through the winding aisles. They walked deeper into the shop, past shelves filled with untitled books, their spines worn smooth. She whispered, "What are these?" "These are the stories left unfinished," the bookseller replied. "Stories that were meant to be written but never were. Dreams never followed. Ideas never given form." Marion swallowed. "They're blank." The bookseller stopped at one of the shelves. He reached for a book at random, a thick leather-bound volume with no markings. Opening it, he turned the pages toward her. They weren't blank. They were waiting. Sentences began appearing as soon as she looked at them. Faint, unfinished paragraphs, half-written thoughts. Marion felt a chill run through her. "They change," she murmured. "They do," the bookseller agreed. "Because stories don't truly disappear, they linger, waiting for someone to bring them to life." The chapter she never wrote. Marion couldn't look away. Her mind reeled with 1,000 questions. Were these all stories from forgotten authors, or were they— She hesitated. "Do I have a book here?" The bookseller smiled. Instead of answering, he led her further into the bookshop, toward a small alcove tucked between towering shelves. A single book sat on a pedestal, bathed in the glow of a flickering candle. It was thin, smaller than the others, but unmistakably hers. Marion stepped forward, heart pounding. She ran her fingers over the cover. It had no title, no author, just a waiting presence. She swallowed hard and opened it. And there, on the very first page, she saw it. A story she had started writing 16 years ago. A story she had forgotten. But the book hadn't. The choice. Marion's breath hitched. She knew this story. She had written it as a teenager, scribbled in the margins of school notebooks, drafted late at night when she should have been sleeping. It had been the beginning of something, but she had never finished it. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. Some were filled, others were incomplete, and then, near the end, blank pages, waiting. Marion's throat tightened. "This is impossible," she whispered. The bookseller gave her a long, measured look. "No," he said gently. "This is a second chance." Marion swallowed hard. The candlelight flickered against the page, casting shadows like letters waiting to be written. And suddenly, she knew. She knew why she had come here, why the bookshop had appeared tonight after all these years. This wasn't just about reading. This was about remembering who she used to be, and deciding, once and for all, if she was ready to begin again. She let out a slow breath. Then, for the first time in 16 years, she picked up a pen, and she started to write. Chapter 3, The Story That Was Waiting. The ink on the page shimmered faintly under the candlelight. Marion's hand hovered over the open book, her fingers curled around the weight of the pen. She had written exactly 4 words. Once upon a time. And then she had stopped. The fear of beginning. She hadn't expected it to be so hard. After all, she had written stories before. As a child, she had filled notebook after notebook, crafting worlds, dreaming up characters who felt as real as the people in her life. But now the words felt fragile. She had spent so long believing her stories didn't matter, telling herself that life had more practical things to focus on: bills, schedules, responsibilities. What if she tried to write again and failed? What if she had lost whatever magic she once had? A soft rustle broke the silence. She turned. The bookseller was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Something is stopping you," he observed. Marion let out a slow, unsteady breath. "I don't know how to do this anymore," she admitted. "I don't even know if I ever really could." The bookseller tilted his head slightly. "You did once." Marion looked down at the unfinished pages, frustration curling in her chest. "That was a long time ago." The bookseller studied her carefully. Then in a quiet voice he asked, "Tell me, Marion, why did you stop?" The moment she stopped believing. Marion's fingers tightened around the pen. She had told herself the reasons over the years. Life got busy. She grew up. Writing wasn't practical. But those were half-truths. The real reason, the moment she had stopped believing in her own words, was a memory she had buried for years. And now, as if the bookshop itself had been waiting for her to admit it, the memory rose to the surface. She was 16 years old, sitting in a cold classroom, clutching a printed copy of the first story she had ever dared to share, a story she had written late at night, poured her heart into, and it had landed in the hands of someone who didn't understand it. A teacher, someone she had admired, someone who had read it and sighed, shaking their head. "Marion, writing is a nice hobby, but maybe focus on something more practical, something real. A single moment, a few careless words. And just like that, she had stopped writing. Stopped dreaming. Stopped believing that her words were worth anything at all. The bookshop's answer. Marion exhaled sharply, pulling herself back to the present. The bookshop was silent. The candlelight flickered softly, illuminating the open pages in front of her. The bookseller was still watching, waiting. Marion swallowed. That was the moment. That was when I stopped. The bookseller nodded, as if he had already known. Words have power, he said. The ones we write, the ones we say, and the ones we hear. He stepped forward, gently closing the book in front of her. But tell me, Marion, do you still believe what they told you? Marion hesitated. For years she had carried those words, let them shape her, define her. But sitting here in this impossible bookshop, surrounded by stories that had been waiting, she wasn't so sure anymore. A story only she could write. Marion looked down at the book. It was still hers, still waiting, and suddenly she knew. She knew why the bookshop had called her back. She knew why the bookseller had led her to the shelves of unfinished stories, because the books hadn't given up on her, even when she had given up on herself. Marion let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She reached for the book again, this time not with hesitation but with certainty. And then, with a quiet determination, she picked up the pen, and she began to write. The last page in the bookshop. The bookseller watched her in silence. He did not offer praise, did not interrupt. He simply let her write. And as she did, something began to shift. The bookshop grew warmer. The breathing books along the shelves hummed softly, content. The air settled, like something lost had finally found its way home. And when Marion lifted her pen from the page, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt whole. She turned to the bookseller. What happens now? He smiled. You take the book with you. Marion's breath caught. I can keep it? The bookseller nodded. It was always yours. He stepped back, gesturing toward the door. Marion hesitated. The bookshop hadn't felt like a place she could just walk away from. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the magic had never been in the bookshop itself. Maybe it had been inside her all along. She tucked the book under her arm, casting one last look at the flickering candlelight, the endless shelves, the waiting stories. Then, with quiet certainty, she stepped outside. The house of sleeping books disappears. The door shut behind her. The cool night air met her skin. The streets of Saint-Vienne stretched before her, empty and familiar. Marion turned, half expecting to see the glow of the bookshop's window. But it was gone. No golden light, no chalkboard sign, just an empty space where the bookshop had been. Marion exhaled. She wasn't surprised. Some places, she realized, weren't meant to be found twice. Some places only appeared when you needed them. She looked down at the book in her hands. The pages were real, solid, waiting, and for the first time in years, she knew exactly what to do next. She turned toward home, the weight of the book steady in her arms. And as she walked into the quiet of the night, one thought filled her mind. This time she would finish the story. Thank you for joining us at Midnight Grove for the House of Sleeping Books. Marion's story is one we all share, a story of dreams we set aside, words we were afraid to write, and memories that wait patiently for us to return. As you drift into sleep, may you remember the stories you once loved, the ones that shaped you and the ones that are still waiting inside you. Sleep well, and we'll see you next time for another journey into the quiet magic of storytelling.